Section 6. The second particular is this, that if the ancients did believe the infallibility of councils, yet it doth not follow they believed it upon the account of such a tradition. For they might believe it upon other grounds. It is evident they believed many, nay, to speak the truth, all, doctrines, because they apprehended them to be contained in the Scriptures. And why might it not be so with this? Why might not the fathers believe this, if they did believe it, upon the same misapprehensions and mistakes which the papists at this day run into, concerning the sense of those Scriptures which are alleged for the infallibility of councils? And consequently, the fathers' opinions of the infallibility of councils doth not argue that they received such a tradition from the apostles, but only that this was their opinion, wherein, no less than in other points, they were subject to errors, as I have proved. Section 7. The third proposition is this. It doth not appear that the ancient fathers did believe in infallibility of councils. For trial hereof I shall refer myself to those arguments and authorities which are alleged for the proof of the contrary position. Bellarmine brings 3 arguments to show that the ancient fathers held that general councils could not err, and not one of them speak to the point. His first argument is this. They affirm that the sentence of a general council in the cause of faith is the last judgment of the Church, from which there lies no appeal, and which cannot be made void or retracted. Hence it evidently follows that such councils cannot err, because else it were a very unjust thing to compel Christians that they should not appeal from that judgment which may be erroneous. I answer first. St. Austin did hold that the sentence of a general council may be retracted, though not by private Christians, yet by a following general council. Former general councils, saith he, are corrected by the latter, of which more by and by, and that is enough to show he did not believe it infallible. Secondly, the consequence is weak and denied by the Protestants, and therefore might be denied by the Fathers. If the consequence be infirm now, it could not be strong then. And for this we have the testimony of a papist, S. Clarea, who tells us that Calvin and Robertus Baronius, and all the Protestants, and some others who deny the infallibility of general councils, do nevertheless acknowledge it to be the supreme judge of controversies upon earth, and that such a council hath a determining and decisive power, which all are externally bound to obey to prevent schism. Nor is it unjust, but necessary for the preservation of order, and preservation of worse mischiefs, that there should be a supreme though fallible authority, beyond which there might be no appeal. And as it is no injustice that there lies no appeal beyond the supreme magistrates in civil affairs, though he be confessed to be fallible, so neither can it be any injustice that there can be no appeal beyond the supreme ecclesiastical judicatory in church matters, though it be fallible, provided it be granted, which the Protestants with the Fathers do assert and have proved, that such judicatories do not bind the conscience, but only regulate the outward acts and prevent visible confusions. Section 8. And the same answer will serve for Bellarmine's second argument, which is this. The Fathers and Councils teach that they who do not acquiesce in the sentence of general councils are heretics, and deserve excommunications, and therefore they thought such councils could not err. Answer first. I deny the consequence again for the now mentioned reason. The civil cutting of such as resist the sentence of the magistrate doth as fully prove the magistrate's infallibility as the ecclesiastical cutting of such as do not rest in the sentence of a council doth prove the council's infallibility. Secondly, the Fathers did not account men heretics merely because they rested not in the sentence of a council as such, for then they should have been heretics for rejecting the Arians' council, but because the doctrine which they opposed and the councils asserted was true, and so it was the verity of the doctrine, not the conciliarity, if you will pardon the word, by the sentence by which they judged of heretics. That cannot be an argument that the Fathers believed the infallibility of councils, which is common to those that deny the infallibility, but the calling of those heretics who do not acquiesce in the sentence of councils is common to those that deny the infallibility of councils. For the Protestants themselves have branded and censured and sometimes put to death as heretics such men as in fundamental points of religion have receded from their public confessions of faith, and the decrees of their synods, without ever pretending to infallibility. But that I may improve the Cardinal's argument for him to the highest, put case the Fathers have said that men were bound to believe all the assertions of their General Council. Yet this doth not evince that they thought them infallible. I prove it plainly thus. The Papists maintain that people are bound to believe their pastors, and to receive all their doctrines without examination or hesitation, according to that which Stapleton so largely and frequently defends. The pastors are simply to be heard in all things, and yet they do not hold these pastors to be infallible. So they tell us by virtue of that text, Matthew 23, verse 2, the Jews were bound to believe all the doctrines publicly taught by the scribes and Pharisees, and yet they do not hold that the particular scribes and Pharisees of whom that text speaks were infallible. And the Fathers might justly say all men were bound to believe all the decrees of their councils which then were passed. Not that they thought councils were infallible, but because they judged all their decrees true and consonant to the Scripture. Otherwise, how little they valued the decrees of councils when they apprehended them repugnant to the Holy Scripture may be sufficiently understood by their contempt of the Arian councils. Thirdly, there is in this argument the same spalme, or error, which was through most of the arguments and testimonies of the Fathers pretended in this case. That is, they argue from the authority of councils to their infallibility, and how invalid the consequence is appears from this undeniable argument. Masters, magistrates, parents, bishops, and provincial councils have authority, but not infallibility. If all that the Fathers say to that purpose were put upon the rack, it would prove nothing but this, that they thought, what the Protestants grant, that general councils were the supreme judicatories of the Church, from which was no appeal, and in which all men were obliged peaceably to acquiesce. But that doth not infer infallibility, as we have seen. Section 9. Bellarmine's third argument is this. The Fathers teach that the decrees of general councils are divine and from the Spirit of God, from whence follows that they were not subject to error. And this he confirms by the testimony of Constantine, who, now he is orthodox, is grown considerable, though when he was alleged against him, he was a greater prince than doctor, as we heard even now. Gregory, Nazianzus, Cyril, and Leo, who call the decrees of the Council of Nicaea divine, and say they were offered by the Spirit of God, and so say I too. And it is true of all the decrees of all councils, nay, of all sermons of ministers, which are collected from Scripture, and conformable to it, such as the Nicaean decrees were, that they are divine oracles. But then their divinity, and that which is the consequent of divinity, infallibility, ariseth not from the authority decreeing them, which being not human, could not make the decrees divine, but from the matter of the decrees which was taken out of Scripture, as Bellarmine confesseth, and therefore divine. But if Bellarmine thinks from this particular case to draw a general conclusion, I must make bold to stop him in his career, till he hath told me whether he think this argument solid. The Fathers held the decrees of the Council of Nicaea to be divine, and say it were infallibly true. Therefore they thought the decrees of all councils divine and infallible, and consequently the ante-Nicaean and Arian councils. If he can digest this, I will say he hath a stomach as good as his conscience is bad. Section 10. I think it is time to take my leave of the Cardinal, and come to the Friar Esclera, who, being an ingenious person and coming last, hath doubtless selected the best weapons. And his great argument I find to be this, that the Fathers did generally own the infallibility of the Catholic Church, and consequently the infallibility of great councils, which are the same with the Church, and their definitions are the determinations of the Church. This he largely prosecutes in chapters 20, 21, and 22. For answer, let me premise what I have proved, that if this were the opinion of the Fathers, yet seeing that they confess themselves to be men subject to like passions and mistakes, with others according to that of Austin, neither do you think that because we are bishops we are not liable to irregular motions, but rather let us conceive that we live dangerously among the snares of temptations, because we are men. And seeing the papists confess they have erred in many things, therefore this, if it were true, will afford no solid and sufficient foundation for their faith, but I shall forgive them that infirmity. The argument, however he glories much in it, hath nothing sound from head to foot. How can they expect this argument should prevail with us, when it is rejected by themselves, who deny the consequence of the infallibility of the Church unto that of councils? So doth Camaracensis, as Clarea notes, in these words, a general council may err in the faith, because if it should err, yet it would remain that others without the council did not err, but by consequence that the faith of the Church did not fail. The like saith Penor Mitanus, a council may err, as it hath erred, nor doth this hinder it, that Christ prayed for his church, that it might not err, because although a general council represent the whole church, yet in truth it is not the whole church. All the faithful do constitute that church, whose head and husband Christ is, and that is the church which cannot err. The very same thing, and almost in the same words, saith Antonius, where he adds an instance, that the saying of Jerome was preferred before the decree of a council. Thus you see the consequence is denied by three famous authors of their own. Nay, what say you? If S. Clarea himself deny the consequence, I am greatly mistaken, if it doth not follow from hence that he makes councils infallible no further than they are afterwards received and owned by the Church, and allows them to be fallible where that reception doth not follow, as we shall see hereafter. And therefore the infallibility is fixed in the Catholic Church, not in the council. And consequently the Church may be infallible, and yet the council remain infallible, as those papists that assert councils to have their infallibility from the Pope, which Bellarmine and the Jesuits generally do, confess councils without the Pope's confirmation, and in themselves to be but fallible. For what the Pope's confirmation is, in Bellarmine's opinion, that the Church's reception is in the judgment of S. Clarea, and all the authors he cites to that purpose.